Most monster stories are cautionary tales, some more overt than others. Don't go in the woods at night or the boogeyman will get you. There are a lot of stories in When the Chenoo Howls that are exactly that. Stories told to scare kids away from playing in dangerous places, or sometimes even to scare kids out of being naughty. Aglebemu is one of those monsters. The Bruchacs have written this story about a somewhat more modern day kid, so you can see monsters are still out there. Aglebemu. You can't have it, it's mine, Lewis said as he wrestled the ball out of his little brother Alan's hand. Alan looked at Lewis with sad eyes. We're supposed to share, he said. Lewis shook his head. Not this, he said. This is mine. He tilted his head toward the river that flowed around their island. You almost let it roll into the water. You would have lost it. But I didn't, Alan said. I didn't. He looked like he was about to cry. For a moment, Lewis almost gave in. Then he thought of how long he had waited to have a ball like this. He held it up, seeing how beautiful its white cowhide surface was, admiring the neat hand-sewn stitches. It was the first real baseball to be brought to the island. It had been given to Father by a tall white man whose carriage was pulled by a beautiful roan mare. He had bought one of Father's carved canes and then given him that ball in return. Father had brought it back to the island. Someday, Father said, maybe you'll be really good at baseball. Then he had placed it in Lewis's hand. Lewis held tighter to the ball as he remembered his father's words. No, Lewis said, this ball is mine. Father gave it to me. Aglebemu, said a voice behind him. Startled, Lewis turned around and saw Uncle John Bear. He knew more of the old stories than anyone else on Indian Island. The children all loved to listen to those stories that he'd only tell when the snow covered the ground and people gathered around the fire. Uncle John reached out one of his long, gnarled fingers and gently tapped Lewis on the chest. Aglebemu, he said again. No, Lewis whispered, holding tighter to the ball. Said Uncle John. His deep-set eyes looked straight at Lewis. Aglebemu. Lewis turned and ran as fast as he could, leaving his little brother and the old man behind. He ran around the bend and along the shore of the island until he came to a small boat that was pulled partway up onto the beach. It was his Aunt Molly's boat. He climbed in and ducked down. No one would find him here. I am not Aglebemu, he whispered. I am not. He closed his eyes and leaned back. It wasn't right for Uncle John to call him that, but that name and the story connected to it kept going through his mind. He could hear Uncle John's voice as he told the story 5 months ago when the January ice was thick on the river and the howling voice of the north wind rattled the windows. Long ago, Uncle John had said, there was a great monster known as Aglebemu. He was as tall as a big pine tree. He had a fat green body and a big head with huge eyes and a mouth large enough to swallow a bull moose. His fingers were as long and yellow as the roots of a birch tree. He lived in the waters of our river, and he wanted all the water for himself. So Aglebemu made a great dam upstream. The river dried up. The fish and the other water creatures died. Even the little spirits that live in the river and help the people began to die. But Aglebemu did not care. He wanted the water for himself. He got into that water and he swallowed some of it and floated around in the rest of it. When the people downstream begged for water, he said he could not give them any. It all belonged to Aglebemu, and he kept chanting his name. Aglebemu, Aglebemu, Aglebemu. People tried to fight him, But Aglebemu was so huge that he just opened his big mouth and swallowed them up. Gluskabe, the changer, the one the Creator made to help the human beings, finally had to come. First, he fought with Aglebemu. Then he poked a hole in Aglebemu's stomach with a spear and all the water rushed out. He broke Aglebemu's dam. Then he squeezed Aglebemu and made him very small. He changed him into a bullfrog. In the summer nights, you can still hear him saying his name. Aglebemu, Aglebemu, Aglebemu. Uncle John Barrett paused then and looked around at the circle of children listening to him. I think maybe, Uncle John said, Aglebemu has gotten bigger again after all these years. You see how some people now don't want to share anything. They want to own everything. As Louis remembered that story, he curled up on his side. It was warm inside the boat, and it rocked gently in the water. Louis had not noticed it, but when he climbed in, he'd pushed the boat into the water, and now it was floating slowly out into the river. Louis closed his eyes. When he opened them again, it was dark. He sat up and looked around. Where was the shore? There were no lights to be seen anywhere. The boat had drifted downstream and he did not know where he was. He felt inside the boat for the oars. Then he remembered that he had not seen them. Aunt Molly must have taken them with her. A boat with oars in it was a boat that anyone could borrow, but taking out the oars meant that someone planned to use the boat again soon. Louis put his hand in the water. It was warm and still. That meant he had drifted into a backwater out of the main flow of the Penobscot River. It would be harder for anyone to find him until it was light again. But did anyone know where he was? His heart began to beat so hard that he could hear it pounding. He tried to calm himself down. There's no reason to be afraid, he whispered. He sat back, thinking he would try to sleep again. Aglebemu! Aglebemu! The sound was so loud it made him jump up. He almost fell out of the boat. Aglebemu! He'd heard bullfrogs before, but never one this loud. Maybe it was true what Uncle John said. Maybe Aglebemu had become a giant again. Maybe Aglebemu was going to come and get him because he'd been so selfish. It was true, he knew it now. He had acted just like Aglebemu. Something splashed in the water nearby. He looked over the side of the boat. He could see a big head in the water. It was slowly coming toward him. Perhaps it was only a beaver. But then the moonlight glinted from its big eyes. Aglebemu! 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 Louis shrank back into the boat, closed his eyes. He had seen him. Something brushed against the boat, and the boat began to rock. Louis looked up. He thought he could see a big green hand with fingers as long as tree roots reaching up over the end of the boat. The air shook from the sound of the huge bullfrog's voice. Aglebemu! 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 I'm sorry! Louis shouted at the top of his lungs. I'm sorry! I'm sorry! I'm sorry! Suddenly, the bullfrog's sound stopped. The hand, if it had ever been there, was gone. Louis sat up. He could hear a distant voice drifting over the water. The voice was calling his name. Louis! He knew that voice. It was his father. Louis! A smaller voice called. It was Alan. "I'm here!" Lewis shouted back. A small point of light appeared, coming from around the point of land that he'd not been able to see before in the dark. It was a torch in the front of another boat. Alan held that torch as their father rowed. "Did you see that?" Alan said, his voice excited. "There was something really big next to your boat, Lewis." "I'm glad you found me," Lewis said. Soon he had climbed in with them, and they tied Aunt Molly's boat onto the back of theirs. Lewis sat next to Alan, in front of their father, as he began to row back up the river. Behind them, the bullfrog's voice again began to fill the night. "Aglebemu is pretty loud tonight," Father said. "Sounds like he still wants it all for himself." He looked down at the baseball that Lewis still held in his hand. Alan reached out a hand and patted Lewis's leg. "I saw you get into Aunt Molly's boat," Alan said, "but I didn't want to bother you. When I came back later and saw the boat was gone, I told Father." Alan paused and looked at Lewis. "Did I do good?" Lewis looked down at the baseball that he still held in one hand. He held it out to his brother. "I know you won't lose it," he said.